The Mummy, the Will, and the Crypt by John Bellairs, Chapter 11. The train whistle blew. It was a long, mournful sound. Johnny heard it and smiled faintly. He was sitting on a seat near a window, and he felt groggy because of his cold and fever. He kept drifting in and out of sleep. He wondered what Grandma and Grandpa and the Professor were doing. Were they ranting and raving and tearing their hair? Had they called the police, or were they crying? Johnny felt guilty. "But it's the only way," he said silently. "It'll all work out, I promise. You'll see, you'll see." Johnny looked around. There was only one other passenger in the car, an old lady in a brown winter coat and a flowered babushka. Apparently not many people wanted to travel up to the White Mountains at this time of year. Now a frightening thought struck him. What if the Squam house was closed for the winter? Well, then he would find some other place to stay. The door at the end of the car slammed open. A fat man in a blue uniform stepped in. "Kankamanga Center," he called out. "This way, out!" It was a little after 9 o'clock at night. Johnny dragged himself to his feet, pulled his suitcase down from the overhead rack, and moved toward the door. Steam hissed and billowed around him as he walked down the iron steps. Blearily, he looked around. A light was on in a little old-fashioned station, and next to it was a car with an illuminated sign on top that said taxi. Johnny started to walk faster. Now, if only the cab would take him where he wanted to go. A few minutes later, Johnny's cab pulled up in front of the Squam house. The old inn looked pretty much the way it had when he had seen it last, and the downstairs windows were lit up, which was a hopeful sign. Johnny got out, dragging his suitcase out after him. As he was paying the driver, another wave of fear and loneliness swept over him. Is this place open in winter?" he asked falteringly. The driver laughed. Well, if it ain't, kid, you're gonna have to sleep under them bushes over there." Then when he saw Johnny's scared look, he added, "Old Mrs. Woodley keeps this place open all winter for the rich types who come up here to ski." He looked at Johnny. "By the way, you're kind of young to be riding the rails alone, ain't you? What are you up here for?" Johnny thought quickly. "I'm here to meet my grandpa," he said, glancing toward the hotel. "He's coming over from Center Sandwich to get me." The driver peered at Johnny closely. He seemed to be on the verge of saying something, but he changed his mind, and without another word he rolled up the window and drove off. Again Johnny felt afraid, but with an effort he pulled himself together, grabbed his suitcase, and walked toward the hotel. At first there was no answer when he rang the bell. Then Johnny saw a shape moving behind the pleated curtain in the window on his right. The door rattled open, and there stood Mrs. Woodley, looking just as grim and foreboding as Johnny had remembered her, being back in October. When she saw who was on her porch, she seemed startled, but then her whole attitude changed. The scowl vanished, and Mrs. Woodley smiled, a warm, welcoming smile. "Well, my goodness," she exclaimed. "It's the young man from the camp who came to use my phone. What on earth are you doing up here? Come in. You'll catch your death of cold out there." Johnny was startled by the woman's sudden change in attitude. He was glad that Mrs. Woodley wasn't throwing him out. Incredibly tired, feverish, and sniffly, he lugged his suitcase in and set it down by the reception desk. Mrs. Woodley told him to wait there, that she'd be back in a minute. She disappeared into a back room, and Johnny stood by the desk. He dug his hand into his parka pocket, and it closed over something cold and hard, the lucky matchbox. Johnny pulled the matchbox out and fiddled with it. Rubbing the smooth surface comforted him somehow. When Mrs. Woodley returned, she was holding up a guest book bound in green leather and a fountain pen. She set the book down in front of Johnny and handed him the pen. Johnny paused before signing. Should he use a fake name? No, it was possible that Mrs. Woodley remembered his real name. Bending over the book, he signed John Dixon, slowly and carefully. Mrs. Woodley went on chattering while he signed the book. "Well, it certainly is nice to have guests at this time of year," she said cheerfully. This is the in-between season, you know. The leaves are off the trees and the snow hasn't fallen yet. What are you up here for, by the way, if you don't mind my asking, that is?" Johnny laid down the pen and glanced distrustfully at Mrs. Woodley. He did not like this incredible cheerfulness. Was she putting on an act, or what? As for the question about what he was doing, Johnny had figured it was coming sooner or later, and he had an answer ready, the same one he had given the taxi driver. I'm going to meet my grandpa. He lives near here, over in Center Sandwich. He's going to come over and get me tomorrow, as soon as he can. He might be late on account of his cow is sick." Rather unnecessarily, Johnny added, He lives on a farm." Johnny paused and waited for Mrs. Woodley's reaction. He had pored over a road map on the way up, and he had picked center sandwich because it didn't look like it was on any railway line. Would Mrs. Woodley fall for this little fib? Apparently she would. Closing the guest book, she gazed placidly at Johnny. Well, young man, you're welcome to stay here as long as you need to. You're my only guest at present, and I'll show you all the hospitality I can. Have you had dinner? Johnny had eaten before he left home, but that didn't matter. He still felt hungry. No, I haven't, he muttered, looking around stupidly. Can I get something to eat? Again, Mrs. Woodley was all grandmotherly kindness. Why, of course you can. Good heavens, and you've got a cold, too. You're supposed to eat well when you have a cold. It builds up your resistance. Come on, now, let's go out to the kitchen and see what we can find. Then, clucking and crooning like the queen of all grandmothers, Mrs. Woodley led Johnny out of the lobby and down a short hall that smelled of wood smoke, and into a big, old-fashioned kitchen. Later, after Johnny had finished his meal, Mrs. Woodley took him upstairs to his room. It was a comfortable room, with white woodwork and a high walnut bed. Over the bureau hung a little picture that seemed odd to Johnny. It showed an eye shining out of a pyramid, and on top of the pyramid was a motto, Thou God seest me. After Mrs. Woodley had explained to Johnny where the bathroom was and told him to sleep well, she left, closing the door softly behind her. Johnny was alone. He looked around the room. Except for the weird picture, it seemed very homey and friendly. He ought to be worn out and ready for bed, but for some reason he wasn't. Something inside him was humming like a dynamo, keeping him keyed up and wide awake. He threw his suitcase on the bed and started taking things out of it and putting them in the drawers of the bureau. When the suitcase was empty, except for the crowbar, the screwdriver, and the flashlight, Johnny snapped it shut and stood in a corner. He folded down the bed covers and fluffed up the pillow. Still, there was this humming in his ears. Still, there was a voice inside him saying, Watch out, there's something wrong. Johnny felt frustrated and puzzled. Unless he got some sleep tonight, he would be a total wreck tomorrow when he was supposed to go out to the estate and hunt for the will. He went to the bureau and got out his pajamas. He laid them on the bed, and he was just starting to unbutton his shirt when he had a silly, unforgivable urge to play with his flashlight. A silly, ungovernable urge to play with his flashlight. Johnny laughed. Ever since he was a small kid, he had loved flashlights. He'd owned a wonderful old-fashioned one at once, with a long nickel-plated handle that he would shine out of his bedroom window at night for fun. This flashlight had a blinker button on it, and Johnny had used it to send pretend Morse code messages from imaginary spies or people on sinking ships. Maybe playing with the flashlight now would help him relax. Johnny went to the suitcase and snapped it open. With the flashlight in his hand, he moved to the window. It was a small, slightly crooked sash window, but with some shoving, Johnny got it to slide up. Cold air flowed in, and Johnny shivered. He snapped on the flashlight and shone it into a mass of pine trees in the distance. The circle of light moved over banks of dark green needles. Flash, flash, flash. Johnny pushed the button. This flashlight had one too, and imaginary messages leapt out into the night. Ship sinking, send, help. What Johnny was really sending with his flashes were just dash dit, was just da dit, dit, da. This was Morse for CV, the initials of Champagne Velvet, the champagne of bottled beer. He had gotten it from the radio commercials, and he sent it out over and over again, but this little routine soon got boring. So Johnny wanted to see how far the flashlight's beam would carry. He could just barely make out the open space beyond the pines, the side of a white clapboard house. Would the beam reach it? He held his arm out the window, stretching as far as he could. Despite his efforts, the shaft of light died before it could reach the house. Sighing, Johnny snapped the flashlight off and jerked his arm back. But as he did this, the tip of his elbow struck the sill. His arm went numb and his hand opened and the flashlight fell. Darn! Johnny yelled, annoyed. He peered down at the ground, where there were several little bushes. Maybe they had broken the fall. If the flashlight was smashed, well, Johnny didn't want to think about that. Hastily, he ducked his head back inside the window and slid the sash down. He went to the closet, got out his coat, and put it on. Then, moving slowly and cautiously, he opened the door and stepped out into the hall. It was true that he was the only guest in the hotel, but he certainly didn't want Mrs. Woodley to hear him. He tiptoed down the hall and down the narrow back staircase. The steps complained loudly. But there was not much that Johnny could do about that. At the bottom of the stairs there was a door with a bolt on the inside. Johnny drew back the bolt, opened the door, and moved out into the chilly, dark yard. Suddenly he had a thought. He went back, found a brick, and stuck it in the door. Twigs and gravel crunched under his feet as he picked his way around the corner of the building. Now that he was on the side of the inn, where the window was, stooped over, he sidled along, rubbing his rear against the foundation stone. It was pitch black. With his hand, Johnny combed the top of a low juniper bush. Nothing there. Well, on to the next one. Ah, there it was. Lying on a soft, springy bush, as neat as could be. Johnny reached out and picked the flashlight up. He clicked it on and off. It worked. He heaved a deep sigh of relief and was about to start back toward the door when he came out when suddenly he froze. A voice was speaking somewhere above him. It was Mrs. Woodley's voice, drifting out through a partly opened window. Johnny held his breath and listened. At first, it just sounded like a wordless muttering, but as he listened more intently, Johnny could make out what the old woman was saying, and the words made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. And that's the end of chapter 11.